Hello everyone, it's Tuesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Across South Korea, more and more people are seeing marriage as something unnecessary. And even after marriage, childbirth has become an option, not the norm. Due to this trend, the country is facing a demographic crisis amid a record low birth rate. Just last week, two surprising pieces of data came out. More South Korean women are getting married in their early 40s, and the number of births in South Korea was the lowest for the months of January since the early 1980s. So, why are people choosing not to marry? And why are couples not having children? For an in-depth analysis of the demographic challenge Seoul is facing, we welcome Shin Eun-kyung, Associate Professor at Korea University, into the studio. Professor Shin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Lyman Stone, Director of Research for Demographic Intelligence, on the line. Mr. Stone, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
All right, first question to our Professor Shin. Now, more South Korean women are tying their knots in their early 40s, surpassing the number of brides in their 20s for the second consecutive year. And what's making matters worse is the number of marriages in South Korea crashed to yet another record low in 2022. Could you walk us through the numbers and how serious this is?
Before I answer the question, let me make one thing clear. There's nothing inherently wrong with the individuals who decide to marry later or not to marry, because people have all the right to choose not to marry or postpone their marriage. So, and also, delaying marriage is not only observed in the female population, but also in the male population as well. In fact, the average age of marriage for men in South Korea has been steadily increasing for the several decades, and it now stands at 36 years. There are four main reasons we can think of why. First, increased life expectancy. Second, increased diversity, hence mating gets complicated. Third, increased instability in the labor market. Fourth, increased affordability of living alone. First of all, these changes in the age of marriage must be understood within the context of a significant expansion in the life expectancy. The average life expectancy has increased by 20 years over the past 40 years. In general, people spend 40 to 45% of their expected lifespan as singles, 40% as parents, and the remaining 20% as grandparents. For example, during the Joseon Dynasty, when we had life expectancy lower than 40 years, it was considered natural to get married at the age of 15. Similarly, in the 1970s, when the average life expectancy was 60 years, getting married in one's 20s was common. And today, we have the number around 85 years. It is not so surprising that people are considering getting married around their late 30s.
Right.
Second, the marriage gets more complicated, mating gets more complicated, where society is homogeneous. We even had arranged marriages. But nowadays, people are ever more diversified. Finding the one inevitably become a challenging task and takes more time. Our labor market was relatively stable. Once people graduate from school, find their job, and they had financial security early on, which is not the case anymore. Lastly, living alone becomes so easy. In the past, let's think of very traditional marriage 50 years ago. Back then, half of the population who were on the dating scene need to get married, mostly females, but they couldn't economically be independent, so they needed to get married. But this is not the case anymore. Younger generations don't need marriage for financial reasons. So it seems like not too surprising. However, the decline in the number of marriage and the trend of delayed marriage may have significant social implication, especially when we do not allow alternative unions among our citizens. People may have fewer opportunities for social connections and support. Already, 40% of our population live by themselves. Traditionally, marriage provide a sense of belonging, emotional intimacy, and also social support, which are important factors for mental and physical well-being. When people are not getting married, this kind of relational support from the traditional sources, then it is urgently needed to think about alternative source for the social support. So this trend the policymakers and the broader society need to pay a keen attention to.
Right, I see. Now, Mr. Stone, for policymakers to actively consider the impact of decline in marriages and late marriages, I believe first we need to know implications such trend has. I mean, as a demographer, what does this latest marriage data imply sociologically and economically?
So, on a basic level, if fewer people are married, which is what happens when marriage comes later in life, you'll have more people living alone. Now, that seems obvious. That's what it means to be single. But that has important implications. People living alone don't benefit from the same social support. They may uh, experience greater disruptions to their life from spells of unemployment, from various adverse events. Of course, something like COVID could be more isolating for single people, and so single people's subjective well-being declined more during COVID than married people's. And so, in general, what happens when you have a society of singles is that you have a society that has a different set of risks and exposures and possible harms that people are exposed to than in a society where people have a denser network of social support, and that especially becomes true as people age. Um, if they have no children or no grandchildren or no partner as they enter retirement, it can result in a lot of dependence on market provided care in old age, or of course also publicly provided care, which ultimately either depends on people having savings or generous tax supported framework. The other demographic consequence is that although people can, and in South Korea, though rates are low, people do have children outside of marriages. Nonetheless, marriages in virtually every country around the world tend to promote higher fertility. People in married unions are more likely to have children. And so one consequence of fewer years spent in marriage is fewer children.
Right. So there are many, challenges that singles might have to face in the future. Now, Professor Shin, so fewer marriages are resulting in fewer births, and South Korea this year saw the lowest number of births and highest number of deaths for the month of January since 1980s. The number of births came to just over 23,000, a 6% decrease on year, while the number of deaths was about 32,000, which was surprisingly a 9% increase on year. How do you read these figures?
So, in a nutshell, our population is shrinking, and it's happening very fast. South Korea is facing a rapidly aging population and declining birth rate, which could lead to a variety of economic and social challenges in the future. Low birth rate and high death rate in Korea poses significant concern for a future population and economic perspective. Korea's aging population is attributed to many factors, including the declining birth rate we just discussed and increasing life expectancy with the benefits of the Korean beautiful health insurance system. One of the primary concern is the demographic shift toward aging population. As the proportion of elderly individual increases, the burden of the working age population and to support the social welfare system and care for the elderly will become heavier. This can lead to economic strain and potentially threaten the sustainability of social welfare programs such as pensions and healthcare. Moreover, a low birth rate can result in a shrinking workforce, reducing the overall productivity and economic growth potential of the country. This can lead to reduce, again, the competitiveness in the global economy, limit the country's capacity to innovate and expand its industry. So, high death rate exacerbate these concerns further, reducing the working age population and adding to the burden on the social welfare system. Additionally, the high death rate we just mentioned may lead to an overall decline in life expectancy as well. In sum, the low birth rate and high death rate in Korea proposes significant challenges to the country's future and economic social prospect. It is crucial to develop effective policies and strategies to address these demographic changes, ensure the sustainability and of the country's social welfare system and economic growth.
Right, so definitely need to come up with proper policies to deal with aging population because it could have impact on both economy and of course the society. Right, now Mr. Stone, South Korea is far from alone in terms of such a low fertility rate. In January, China too reportedly recorded its first population decline in decades. Could you elaborate on the demographic changes in other countries?
We are seeing fertility declines in lots of countries, all over the world, and even in countries with formerly high fertility, like France or the Nordic countries in Scandinavia. So we do see fertility decline in a lot of countries, probably associated with a mixture of the long-run effects of the 2008 financial crisis, but also social changes arising from becoming we could say, an Instagram society, a society where the social prestige that accrues to the single life is changing very rapidly. However, I do think it's important to understand one basic thing, actually two things. First is that although there's decline everywhere, South Korea is unique. There's no other country in the world where fertility is as low as South Korea. Now, there are a few of the big cities in China, like Shenzhen and Shanghai, have fertility rates that are similarly low. But these are genuinely remarkable anomalies. It's a more severe situation than we see anywhere else in the world. And secondarily, these very low birth rates are not arising because people in Korea don't want kids. There are a lot of surveys that ask people in Korea, how many children do you want to have? And in general, people tend to report around two. Around the world, we know that stated fertility preferences are pretty strong predictors of people's behavior once you account for their union status and a few basic material factors. So it stands to reason that what's going on in Korea is not that people just don't want children. It's that there's a set of circumstances, material, cultural, social, individual, personal, whatever. There's different circumstances coming together in Korea that make it too difficult or impossible for Korean women to achieve the desires that they say they have for their family lives. This is a story of disappointment, not radical change in values.
Right. I mean, it's quite an unfortunate thing to hear that Korea is in a quite unique situation right now. Now, Professor Shin, since we have taken a closer look at the numbers, let's dig deeper into the question of why. I mean, why are women in South Korea distancing themselves from getting married and giving birth to children?
So distancing themselves from getting married and having children is not an exclusive matter only applicable to females. Both men and women in Korea are increasingly feeling the burden of marriage and child rearing. I think it's because we're still too closely observing the traditional family model. Given the fast unfolding of Korean history, each generation lived a very distinctive historical context, socially and economically. Traditional marriage was based on a binary gender role where men took the economic responsibility and women took the child care responsibility. In our grandparents' generation, most people did not have much difficulty maintaining such traditional model of marriage because women had fewer opportunities for social participation. South Korea once was deeply rooted in the patriarchal society with this kind of very strict gender role. But this binary doesn't work anymore. For the younger generation, having a job is an important part of their identity. For females and males, keeping up their careers for the sake of the family would be a tremendous burden for both of them. Traditional marriage model is incompatible with this idea. The traditionally, unfortunately, and also still prevalent model places a significant economic burden on one side and significant child rearing burden on the other side. So it seems natural and even rational for people to feel burden of the system. Unfortunately, most of the marriage we observe, the younger generation especially, in the current society, are based on the traditional model. People do not want to have or cannot have the kind of traditional marriage which heavily rely on this strict gender division. It does not mean that people don't want the romantic union of two citizens. It's just they do not want the traditional one.
Right, so it looks like traditional family model or traditional marriage model would have to change to tackle the issue. Now, Mr. Stone, I saw your interview saying the overarching culture of workism here in South Korea is also very much related to the falling fertility rate. Could you elaborate more on this?
Absolutely. I want to emphasize a couple things that Professor Shin said. People's careers are increasingly important to them. This is true in Korea, but this is true of young people really around the industrialized world, that careers are increasingly not just a way to get a paycheck, they are a source of meaning, they're a source of identity. And really what we see throughout a lot of modern life is a shift in where people get identity. Instead of getting it from a communitarian source like your family or your town, your country, a religious group, people increasingly get identity from purely individual sources. Their achievement, their individual achievement in competitive schooling, their success, their individual success in a very ambitious career. These sorts of things. These are highly individualist. And in particular, what they do is they create lives that are less compatible with other people. When your sense of meaning and identity is not built around participation in a community that makes space for other people, but instead is built around your own personal experience, the result is that it's much harder to fit another person in, whether that's a spouse or a child. I also agree with what Professor Shin said about work and family incompatibility. It's very clear that the traditional family model of a male breadwinner is not extremely popular, particularly with women. But I also want to emphasize that the situation is actually a bit harder than that. It's not as if Korean men with more liberal attitudes are getting married at high rates. Korean men who want a more progressive marriage are not getting married either. So it's not just a question of desiring a progressive marriage. It's a deeper structural question. And the reality is, if you're working a 63-hour week, you don't have time for romantic relationships. If you're in a system where, having a bad score on one test could ruin your future, you don't have time for a romantic relationship. It's these high stakes tournament style rewards for just egregiously excessive work commitments that is driving relational dysfunction and moving away from family life. The upshot of all of this is that Korea really needs, Korea and many countries, Korea is not alone in this by any means, but it is an example of a place where there needs to be serious reflection on the role of work as a source of meaning, as a source of value, and in particular as a source of unlimited demands on time and attention. There needs to be limit on the place that work and career can have in our lives.
Right, I see. Very interesting. I think the punchline would be let's work less to marry.
Yeah.
Now, Professor Shin, now let's move on to how the country should tackle this demographic issue. The South Korean government has poured, more than 300 trillion in Korean won, as far as I know, into solving this issue for over 17 years. But what major policies have the government introduced up till now, and what do you believe was lacking that made this happen?
So South Korean government has implemented various policies and measures aimed at addressing the country's decline in birth rate and aging population. Some of the major policies include financial incentive for having children or improving work-life balance, as we discussed, and expanding child care services. And the government has implemented policies to promote marriage. One of the research at my lab, I examined the timing of menopause among Korean women. Using the Korean National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, we utilized 18,992 female data from 2007 to 21. We found there is a significant delay in menopause age among Korean women. That means, ironically, we have a longer reproductive possibility, but with a low birth rate. We laughed wonder, why so? Unfortunately, the policies heavily and narrowly rely on the traditional marriage concept. For example, in Korea, if you're not married, the fertility checkup is not covered by health insurance. They need to pay $300 to $400 out of their pocket for examination. Why is that so? Only married men and women can plan having babies? Given the fact that more and more people are getting married in their late 30s and 40s, regular medical examination should be covered by insurance. So the current policy is heavily rely on close coupling between marriage and birth giving. We should really relax this assumption. To be effective, policy aimed at increasing the birth rate and addressing the aging population must take a comprehensive approach, addressing not only financial incentive, but cultural norms and social expectations.
Right, so what matters is the comprehensive approach to tackle the issue, right? Now, since we are running out of time, Mr. Stone, I think this would be our last question. I would like to look at the examples overseas, what policies did nations that have managed to avoid dramatic declines in marriages and fertility rates take? What examples could South Korea refer to?
There are very few examples of countries that have avoided steep declines in fertility. As I said, this is occurring in many, many places. There are policies that can help. As was mentioned, generous financial supports to parents, to couples can boost the fertility rate somewhat from South Korea's current rate of, 0.78 children per woman. More generous financial supports getting, Korea now is around the OECD average for family support levels. If you rose to 150% of the OECD average, maybe you could push fertility rates back up to one child per woman. But that's still extremely, extremely low. All these financial support policies, all these efforts to put more money into families, they're worth doing. I support them. They're wonderful ideas, but they won't get the job done. To get the job done, what you really need is you need to first tackle work. Work has to become less. People have to work less, and they have to be less emotionally invested in it. There needs to be a way to get people seeing family as the core of their life again. Second, we have to think about marriage. It's true that the traditional coupling of marriage and childbearing creates a lot of problems for unmarried people who want children. But at the same time, there are very few unmarried people who want to become parents without a partner. Even if they're not married, they want a stable partner. That's very typical. So we have to think about how to get people into stable partnerships where they make commitments to each other that can guarantee support as a parent. And that usually, but not always, means marriage, which means we need to think not only about encouraging fertility, that's one thing, but also how can we encourage marriage? How can we support marriage? And one way to do that is to make sure that any means-tested programs, aid for poorer people, don't discriminate against married people. You should never lose a benefit just because you got married. And currently in Korea and in virtually every country, there are means-tested programs that you will lose if two working people get married, which is a marriage penalty.
Right, I see. As interesting topic as this is, I'd like to ask more to our experts, but unfortunately this is all the time we have for today's edition. But thank you, Professor Shin and Mr. Stone, for your insights. We really appreciate it. Now, this is all for Within the Frame tonight. We will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.